My name is Arun, and I work as an analyst at Gartner. Gartner is a research and advisory firm. We produce a lot of research, and we advise all kinds of IT leaders, CIOs, CTOs, VPs of IT, VPs of security, VP of software, and so on and so forth. I've been primarily covering two areas for the last 15 years. I started covering cloud and cloud computing in 2009, public cloud specifically. And I've been covering that for 15 years now, and I started covering big data, machine learning, and AI in 2014. I've been covering that for roughly 10 years now. And it's very safe to say that in the last 2 years I've done nothing but Gen AI and LLMs. I've had lots of great conversations with people like you, roughly maybe we've spoken to close to 2,000 customers, I would say very safely in the last 15 to 18 months. And I'm happy to be, as I said, spending this time with you. I'm not going to be presenting, so this is an open-ended session. I just wanted to have this slide as a backdrop. I did a session today morning. I don't know how many of you are able to attend it, where I presented kind of some of the practices that we started to see emerge from the leading adopters in terms of how they're trying to bring Gen AI in a safe and in a more secure way within their organization, as well as how they're scaling this from a project in a lab to a more widespread deployment across the enterprise. So those are some of the practices that I shared today morning. Again, I can quickly summarize it. First and the most obvious is you need to have a framework in terms of how you prioritize and go after use cases. You really want to prioritize use cases that have tangible business value, as well as use cases that are really technically feasible to implement. The second, obviously, is we want you to pilot the use cases so that you understand the idiosyncrasies of your use case and you're able to pivot, or you're able to refine, or you're able to even stop use cases that shouldn't be going into production. Obviously, we want you to think more deeply about where you want to build and where you want to buy AI. At a very high level, for a lot of back office applications, you may want to buy AI rather than build it on your own. Whereas for high risk, high control, or areas where you can competitively differentiate, you want to obviously build and own those products. We advocate customers to take more of a product ownership or a product management approach to AI, where you're constantly scanning the market for new technologies, new models, and new techniques. And also, you're engaging in conversations with users, whether they are internal users or external users, and incorporating their feedback very early into the product before their eventual release to the actual users. We advocate also taking a more modular approach to Gen AI and how you build those platforms, given that the models are evolving at a rapid pace, and the model that you're using today may not be the model that you're going to be using 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line. So you want to really have an architecture that's flexible, that's composable, that's modular enough, where you have the ability to swap models. Obviously, AI models are only as good as the data that goes into it. So clearly, how you bring the data, how you do more automated labeling annotation of the data, or how you use maybe even things like synthetic data as an alternative to real data. I think how you really architect that data engineering pipeline and how you bring data into LLM workflows is important. You want to stay on top of costs and keep the cost low in Gen AI environments as they scale. Particularly. There are many organizations that are guilty of choosing really large models or doing very expensive customization of the models, which obviously lends itself to really high costs. We want to avoid some of those mistakes. Obviously, we believe that literacy is extremely important, both on the business side and as well as the technology side. For example, prompt engineering is a term nobody had heard 15 months ago, and yet, I tell my 8-year-old daughter that she needs to know how to do proper questions to ChatGPT, which is a very basic form of prompt engineering. We need to obviously ensure that humans are integrated into the AI workflow, and AI is also integrated into the human workflows. What I mean by that is have a human in the loop to vet the output of the model, and the AI tools are integrated into the native applications and services that the users are using. And finally, we want to put responsible AI at front and center of everything that we do, where we take enough steps to mitigate the privacy, security, explainability, and fairness risks that are associated with AI. So that's a really quick rundown of the 10 practices that I advocated today. But again, this is a very open question and answering forum. You don't have to stick to this. You can ask me any questions about Gen AI, large language models, or even more broadly, any questions about AI, and I'm here for it. Yes, we'll go here.
Besides switching to a smaller language model, what other ways companies should explore to reduce costs?
Yeah, I think this question is, okay, the most obvious way to reduce cost is to use small language models. What are the other ways to reduce cost, right? By the way, this is a research note that I'm writing as we speak. I published the 10 best practices for scaling GenAI 3 months ago. Luckily, this was very popular. There's a lot of demand for this content, events like this and our events. And then I realized that the cost topic was becoming a very popular topic of inquiry. And I'm actually now writing a top 10 best practices for reducing GenAI costs as we speak. But let me try to summarize that research, right? At a high level, we could be doing things architecturally, we could be doing things operationally, and we could be doing things in terms of change management. So architecturally, the most obvious one is to choose a small language model where it's feasible. But apart from that, the other thing you could also do is, to the extent possible, you want to avoid self-hosting models. The self-hosting models can be very punitively expensive, at least during the initial phase of deployment. And also, you really get into the trade-offs between CapEx and OpEx very early in the life cycle, where you don't want to stand up a big infrastructure on premises, right, for running a pilot as an example. We also advocate customers to try prompt engineering and RAG and really push the envelope of what is possible with prompt engineering and RAG before they decide to do any level of fine-tuning. Or to say the other way, don't fine-tune it unless you really, really have to. Because fine-tuning can be, again, complex and quite expensive. And more importantly, one of the dynamics with fine-tuning, particularly if the models are running in the cloud, and as you probably know, most of the popular models are available only in the cloud as a cloud API today, is apart from the inferencing cost that you pay, you also pay a 24/7 hosting fee if you're fine-tuning a model. Because when you're fine-tuning a model, you're creating a custom model that is quote-unquote dedicated to you. And obviously the cloud provider is going to say, hey, I cannot monetize this model with any other user or any other customer. So you've got to pay for like a 24/7 hosting fee for it, right? So those are some of the things you should be careful about architecturally. On the inferencing side, obviously more effective prompt engineering can reduce the cost of ownership, right? Because if you guide the models to be very precise and concise in their responses, because as you know, most model providers today charge you based on number of tokens. And at a very basic level, number of tokens, one token is like 3/4 of a word. And that includes both the input that you provide to the model as well as the output of the model itself, right? So the more concise you can be, which obviously is a function of how good your engineers are, how good your business users are with prompt engineering, the lower the cost is going to be. I also spoke about caching, as one way to also lower the operational cost, where, for example, if somebody asks a question, who set foot on the moon, and somebody else asks a question, who was the first person to land on the moon? Obviously they're framed differently, but they're basically the same question essentially, right? So you don't have to make an LLM API call. You essentially serve the response from a cache, from a local cache, for example. We're also seeing more advanced techniques, by the way. For example, one of the techniques that's also gaining some very early interest is called LLM cascading. So what is LLM cascading is, you have a bunch of models that are running in the cloud. And then you as a user say, I want to use the best model for this use case. And then you say, I want the model to have 90% accuracy. I want the model to have 5-second latency. And I want the model to be no more expensive than some value that you set. And we're now starting to see solutions. We call them model routers, for the lack of a better word, where they could take your prompt and they can tell you, hey, this is the right model that meets your requirements, which is, it's giving you the accuracy that you want, it's giving you the speed that you want, but it's also able to give you the cost that you want, which means that you're kind of choosing the best model that is optimized for your use case, where you're trying to balance price, performance, and it's kind of speed
is
of
it
these
part
models.
of the prompt routing discussion? Prompt routing discussion?
Yeah, I would call it more or less like model routing rather than, it is prompt routing, which is it actually routes your prompt to be answered by the right model on the back end. So those are some of the ways in which you can actually minimize the cost of Gen AI. There are of course things you could also do contractually. When you contract with the vendors, obviously you can explore, particularly with the cloud providers, you can prepay commits, and you can essentially use those prepaid commits to lower your upfront cost. Obviously you can negotiate with one of the Gen AI products, you can negotiate and lower the pricing. There are also a few things you can do contractually as well to reduce the cost. Right, of course.
Yeah, okay. I'm interested in the intersection of Gen AI and automation, and you mentioned autonomous agents. So can you please elaborate on that? The next part of the question is, I've heard of large action models. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I mean, it's a very intriguing and a very popular topic these days. So what is the idea behind autonomous agents? As I explained at a high level, autonomous agents take a higher level intent from you, and they're able to break that high level intent into a series of execution steps that can orchestrate and execute on our behalf, right? And there are a couple of ways to actually think about autonomous agents today. By the way, autonomous agents as a concept is not super new. In fact, if you go back to last year, which is last year in Gen AI world is like 5 years in the normal world. If you think about it, we had products like AutoGPT, Baby API in the consumer world. I don't know if you're really familiar with it. And the idea behind that was exactly what I described, which is to take higher level intent and really translate that and orchestrate into actions. So that's which essentially means that we're going to reduce the amount of prompting and prompt engineering that needs to be done by a human being, because it can take your intent and it can generate what is called as meta prompt or system prompt on its own to actually execute your task, right? So you're obviating the need for an enormous amount of knowledge of the user, and you're kind of transferring a lot of that back to the agent or the model itself. Today, this is a very nascent space. There are not a lot of frameworks that are available. I think the only framework that I should correct myself, there are a bunch of frameworks that are available. The more enterprise-grade framework, I believe, is actually coming from Microsoft. So Microsoft has released a framework for agentic architecture. There are a couple of open source frameworks that are available as well. I think one of the early open source frameworks around agents is actually come out of the Allen Institute for AI. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's a think tank that's based out of University of Washington. It's obviously founded by Paul Allen, who passed away, who was one of the co-founders of Microsoft. As you probably know, who's a big philanthropist in the Northwest, in the Seattle, Oakland area. And they actually released an agent framework that's available in GitHub. It's an open framework, but these are like super nascent at this point in time. Now, your question, there's the second part of your question on large action models. So the way to think about large language models are mostly passive models, in the sense that you have to prompt them, which is you have to activate them or invoke them for them to actually provide you a response. In comparison, at a very basic level, a large action model can observe human behavior, and it can emulate human behavior through observation. In fact, one of the early companies that really started talking about large action model was a startup called Adapt AI. Again, I don't know how many of you have heard of Adapt. Adapt was, one of the founders of Adapt is Ray Hoffman. I'm sure many of us know Ray Hoffman. Thanks to him, we're using LinkedIn. He's one of the co-founders of LinkedIn. So Adapt AI so they actually even have a demo of like a model that is mimicking like human browsing habits as an example, right? In terms of browsing and kind of fetching information, where the machine is doing it rather than kind of a human being doing it. This year, we've actually seen a couple of other companies, more in the consumer space, also talk about large action models. One of them is obviously this company called Humane AI. I don't know how many of you have heard of them. They, I think if you live in San Francisco, I'm assuming that you started seeing maybe at least 1 or 2 people wearing those pins on their pocket, which is basically AI as hardware or LLM as hardware. It's basically a pin that listens to the world surrounding it. I can't even imagine the privacy implications of that. And challenging is a mild way of putting it. So that's one. And the other company that also talked about it was a company called Rapid, which actually has a consumer device that's going to come, I think, sometime later this year. Again, the idea behind that is, it's a simple way to think about that is, think of it like a super app on your phone. For example, let's assume that you're meeting Arun and you say, hey, let's get connected on LinkedIn and let's chat, right? I mean, today, that process is very kludgy. You and I get connected on LinkedIn. After this event, we forget to link back, there's no calendar invitation and so on. But imagine in the scenario where it'll take that intent, which is to say, oh, you and I want to connect and we want to chat. It'll connect you and I on LinkedIn, and then it'll go and check my calendar for an available late. And if you're on, I don't know, Calendly or one of those open calendars, it'll go check your time. It'll go ahead and get access to my collaboration tool. For example, if I'm using WebEx or Google Meet, it'll go and pull information, schedule that for you. So that's the kind of applications that are getting built through these large action models, where the focus is on execution and orchestration, essentially based on the high-level intent that we set for themselves. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around permissions management and access rights and API integration with all of these services and so on and so forth. So all of this is very conceptual, very idea-oriented in this point in time, but that's kind of the future that we envision. And I think OpenAI has more and more started talking about autonomous agents as a pathway for what they call as AGI, right, which is to have human intelligence. I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to come to you. I think there were a couple of hands this side as well. But yeah.
So in the presentation earlier this morning, you had the segment about build versus buy, and said, in general, you recommend customers not to build their own models. How do other companies or customers justify the cost of buying versus trying to build something in-house? Because generally, we're looking at ROI, does it make sense, can we do this on our own? So what's the best way forward there?
Absolutely, yeah, it's a great question. I think, I want to be very careful, right? When I said, I mean, I still believe what I said, by the way, which is, I don't think a lot of organizations should be building their own models from the scratch, right? But I did not say that organizations should not be doing fine-tuning or some customization using RAG, right? I actively advocate, in fact, for RAG, where you're taking a pre-trained model, but you have more control over what data you bring into it and so on and so forth, right? I do believe that organizations want to have that control, particularly in high-risk style environments where they deploy the model. Now, to your question on how do you justify the build versus buy, I mean, how should they really think about it? Right? On a high level, the advantage of a build almost always is the fact that you have better control, you have more opportunities for customization, for specific tasks, for example, and also in many cases, organizations are genuinely worried about sending data to the cloud. Right? They're worried about their prompt data being, transmitted to the cloud, where the model providers may use the data in many different ways that they do not, want them to. Particularly, I think this is a fear, not with the big providers. I don't think somebody is going to say, well, I'm worried that Microsoft is going to take my data and do something with it. But it's more or less with like tier 2 and tier 3 providers, because I'm sure every vendor that you're working with is knocking on your doors and saying, we've got AI, we've got Gen AI, and I'm sure you're like, is this simple rules-based automation versus AI? Is this classic machine learning with Gen AI? I mean, this is so much to unpack there, essentially. And I think all of those are reasons to build. But the reason to buy, in my opinion, almost always is one, faster time to market in most cases. And that I think is important in certain domains and in certain scenarios. The second is maybe a more pragmatic view of the true capabilities of your organization, right? I mean, and you got to be honest with yourself, right? Because every organization is different in terms of your culture, the kind of skills that you have, how long have you done AI for, and so on and so forth. And there might be many customers here that might say, what? We don't have a lot of data scientists and data engineers to actually go and build these models ourselves, and we're just better off buying from third-party vendors. I also think that there are specific domains within our organization where it's just more conducive to buy rather than build. For example, for a lot of IT-centric use cases, for example, if you want to use AI for generating code, do you really believe that you should build a code generation model? I don't think so, right? Because the code generation tools that are out there are pretty good. Many of these code generation tools give you enough flexibility. For example, many vendors are starting to allow their models to be trained in your code, right? Rather than using a generic code generation model. Many of these providers are saying, hey, if you want to run the models within your firewall, we could do that as well, which is SaaS is not the only way you can actually consume a model. So there's enough flexibility that I believe that, that is being provided, and I think that's enough to assuage concerns. So at a high level, to me, it depends on whether it's a back office or a front office. More back office, you would buy, more front office you would build, and the second obviously is the level of control that you want to have in the environment. Obviously this is where working with your legal and compliance teams becomes super important to make sure that you're gauging the risk adequately well, you're choosing the right models and right providers for the right use case. I'm going to come to you.
So my question is more about, we have tons of use cases coming from every line of business. And to scale to all of that is becoming a challenge. So one of the things we are thinking about is enabling as an approach. Your thoughts on that? Because it's negative, not like, or enable.
Okay, you're saying that you're almost like a broker or an orchestrator within the organization, where you're facilitating.
Yes. So think of it more like a, let's say, a typical center of excellence.
Yeah.
They are building the core components,
Yeah.
and sometimes they execute as well. But in this case, we think that doing that with a small team is going to be very challenging. To scale faster, to make these, get out the architecture, get out the components, like make it available for other teams to consume. And have you seen this?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, yeah, I know there are many organizations, particularly I think people in like enterprise architecture, AI architecture style functions. I mean, that's exactly the way they think about it, which is they're primarily focused on a few things. One, they're focused on making sure that whatever products, whatever models are being used internally within the organization are vetted. So they have like a, hey, we've approved these model providers because we've looked at their model training process, we've looked at their security privacy practices. So we certify these, we don't certify these. It's a little bit like the cloud in a broad sense, right? Where you have like this is our standard operating environment in the cloud, this is the landing zone. So we kind of define the architecture for that. We certify these products and we don't certify these products. The second step obviously is to really understand the user experience that's involved there, and making sure that you have either the vendors themselves are building user experiences that are very relatable and very intuitive, especially for the users. The third part obviously is regulation, compliance, and security, where you're brokering and working with your internal security and compliance teams and facilitating that. So I think the COE that you kind of portray here, where you're not kind of building, but you're playing the role of governance and orchestration and enablement. I kind of see this in quite a few organizations. In fact, we argue that that's one of the things that AI COEs should be doing. When I think of an AI COE, I know it's an adjacent question, not the core question. I primarily think there are three responsibilities for a COE. Right? The first responsibility is architecture, which is to make sure that you have the right architecture, right products, they are integrated very well with each other. The second pillar, I would argue, is evangelism, which is to make sure that the products that you have are actually being consumed by people within the organization. Evangelism is many things. It's training, education, it's making sure that the products are, the know-how about the products are more broadly disseminated within the organization. Some of them do things like hackathons and so on, just to boost the knowledge of how to use these tools within the organization. And the third pillar, I would argue, is primarily around upskilling talent and communications, which is to make sure that you have continual learning and continuous skills to continue using these tools by within the organization. In fact, I don't know again if you're a Gartner client or not. If you are, we have an AI COE document that you can certainly refer to really understand those capabilities better. I think you.
So on the 13th of March last month, the EU AI Act.
It's not a law yet, but it will become a law soon.
It is.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
I thought the European Commission has not ratified that into a law. I mean, I think the...
They have.
Oh, okay.
They have now for 6, 12, and 24 months.
Okay, okay.
Depending on the categorization of AI. So I'm interested, because I'm working with some tech company in the US, and one of the areas was about profiling, which is not permitted under the AI Act. This all pulls back to, first we have this design by default, another responsible AI component of that, which dovetails into the EU AI Act. I'm interested in your thoughts, your observations as to what you've seen and what the likely response is going to be.
Yeah. So I think, it's a very broad topic in itself, and I'm not like a super deep expert on legal issues. The way I see it is, there are clearly going to be certain responsibilities for the model creators. The model creators, in terms of how they build these models, how they ensure equitable value for the actual data owners in many cases. In fact, if you remember, even before the EU AI last year, ChatGPT was banned in Italy for a relatively short span of time, precisely for this reason, because Italian government believed that OpenAI was not, being fair, essentially, for the data owners, within those countries. And then there's going to be a set of safety controls around what constitutes a safe release of the model. Because today, the reality before the EU AI Act is there is no law on what constitutes a safe release of the model, right? It means that anybody can release a model with no, risk mitigation steps baked into it, right? I mean, all of the RLHF and everything that they're doing is kind of voluntary at this point in time, right? I think the law is going to make it, sorry.
I was going to say, and that's where you're seeing a lot of requests now from brands asking for the model cards.
Yes.
To see more about
Right.
what's inside.
So I think it's going to bring hopefully more transparency into it. Model cards are one part of it, because with model cards to me are the equivalent of the processed food in the US, right? Or for that matter, any part of the world where you actually know what is inside and how much sodium, how much added sugar, and so you can actually make an informed decision before eating the food. So model cards are an important part of it, which is it brings better transparency so that you have a greater understanding of the data sets that were used to train the model, the weights of the model, what licenses is the model released, assuming it's an open source model. So I actually think that the regulation is going to force the model creators to be a little bit more transparent than they are. The hope essentially last year was all of these big model companies, they are all closed sourced and proprietary, right? OpenAI, despite the name, as we all know, is a very secretive and a closed source company. And then we started seeing the rise of open source models, and everybody was super excited to say, finally we have more transparent models. But ironically, many of these open source models, although they are quote unquote open source, they're not truly open. In the sense that, first of all, many of them have their own software licenses, which is they don't comply with the Apache 2.0 or an MIT style license, right? For example, Databricks released a model last week. It's had its own license. Meta has released Llama 2 under a special license, right? Where, in fact, the OSI, which is the company behind open source, has said, Llama 2 model is technically not open source. Databricks model is not technically open source because there are caveats within the model release that are just not transparent enough, abiding by the core principles of open source. But even worse, many of these companies also don't tell you what data sets the models were actually trained on. I mean, even with Meta, you don't know what model. I think fundamentally, it's because this is becoming such a critical competitive differentiating factor, which is why there's so much secrecy. But I'm really hoping that with the EU Act, we actually take these model creators to task at some level and really make things a little bit more transparent. To your point, have more model card style, publicly digestible and easy information, and also information that's delivered in a more standardized way. You know what I mean? Because you could then compare models in a more standardized way relative to each other. But also as a user, now you're going to have more onus as a user. For example, there are certain use cases, if I understand it correctly, in the EU AI Act that is very problematic, that the AI Act actively dissuades you from. One example of that is facial recognition. Right? Facial recognition is an extremely problematic use case. So using AI for making automated hiring decisions is another very unpopular use case because these models have an enormous amount of bias against women, for example, right? Which is why we still have a pay gap for the same occupation between men and women today. So I'm hoping that with the EU AI Act, we will see more onus both on the model providers and hopefully more onus on the users as well to make sure that they're essentially picking use cases that are a lot less problematic and they're really protecting the privacy and the rights of the consumers. And big fines. I mean, I heard that the fines can be as high as 7% of your entire revenues.
7.5%.
7.5%.
7.5% of your global turnover.
Yeah.
Or 35 million euros, whichever is greatest.
Right.
Greatest.
Whichever is not lower. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I heard. Yes, awesome. Okay. I think I'm going to come to you and then I'm going to come to you.
Pete?
Yeah.
All right. Many of the use cases today have human in the loop from a safe, scalable approach perspective. So with recent research study announced by Anthropic of many shot jailbreaking of the large language models, what steps do you think we should think about mitigating if you want to take a step away from removing the human in the loop And also from a timeline perspective, based on analysis, how long do you think
Yeah.
before we can get there?
Yeah, it's a great question actually. I think it's a question that I often think about as well because the models are scaling so fast, the use cases are scaling so fast, and unfortunately, humans don't scale that fast, right? I mean, having a human in the loop sounds like the right answer, but in many use cases, it's just not a practical answer, particularly if your use cases are more real-time or close to real-time oriented, right? Now, I fundamentally believe there are two things that are very important, as a substitute for human, right? One, I think I spoke about this very briefly today, Martin, which is we have to have better processes for safety testing these models before releasing the models. The whole red teaming as an approach, where you're actively trying to seek out many different ways in which the model will fail or the model will hallucinate, and you're essentially using a lot of that training. For example, I spoke to an organization that's using a code generation model. So they essentially train the code generation model on their private code, right? And the provider guaranteed that their private code is not going to be used to train the model. But yet, their worry is not so much about whether the code is being taken or not. Their worry is somebody could ask a prompt and their code could be revealed in the prompt. So they did extensive stress testing or red teaming of these models where they almost like hid their code in the model and they were trying to ask in the prompt whether to see whether the model is going to provide that hidden code or not, and then eventually it did not provide and they were kind of satisfied with that and moved. So one aspect of it is we have to really start thinking about red teaming at scale, when we release these models in production and live environments. And we need to really start thinking about how we want to do that extended testing, right? That's one part of it. But that alone is not going to solve the problem, right? I truly believe the way maybe things will evolve in the future is, again, this is kind of a bit of a science fiction, is you'll have a generative model like the way you have today. And then you have another model which is more like a combative model. If you think about the GAN architectures, if you're familiar with GAN, I mean, that's how GANs essentially work, right? Which is you have a generator and then you have like a discriminator, as they call it. The generator is, for example, you say, paint a picture of Arun, and the generator paints a picture of Arun. The discriminator says, that doesn't look like Arun at all, it looks like a monkey. We should be doing better. So the point essentially is, it's almost like a tug of war between these two unless you get it accurate. So I envision that we will have a combative model that is trying to either jailbreak the primary model or it's trying to wet the output of the model for accurate information, and it's also, in some sense, preventing, things like jailbreaks because you have like a firewall that you deploy in front of the LLM, very similar to like a application firewall that you have today, right? So you'll have more security tools that we will deploy at the gateway of the bulk of these models. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it, particularly for content moderation, essentially is you'll have another AI model that is trained hopefully on more high quality and accurate data sources that is trying to wet the output that's coming out of the model, and it's saying, this is just factually inaccurate, whereas this is accurate, right? So that is one of the ways in which we can really scale. So it's a combination of three things I've said, right? One is the red teaming and the safe release process. The second is more firewalls in front of these models for prompt injection attacks, data poisoning attacks. The third, obviously, is to have more combative AI that is doing a lot of content check and content moderation primarily on these models.
Thank you.
I think I saw another hand here. Yes.
Yeah, I want to know from you about the knowledge management changing, right? I think before the GenAI, before the RAG process, the knowledge base or knowledge management in enterprise are designed for human. Now because of the RAG, we start feeding data into the AI model. But AI does not read the data as human read exactly the same. Do you want to hear your comment on? I think you're seeing changing in this perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question actually. I think it's a question that a lot of people have asked me before, where the fundamental realization for a lot of organizations is their entire data flows today are human oriented, right? I mean, fundamentally, if you think about an enterprise data flow, it's all about a human sitting in front of a computer and reading a report or reading a dashboard of some kind, right? And the entire workflow is really orchestrated and organized around it. And to your point, that's going to change in the future because you're going to have data that's being fed directly to LLMs where a human is not really viewing it. Now, what does that mean, from a data flow standpoint? I think it primarily means a few things. Again, as you can imagine,
I want to sound it's not like I'm the expert on all of these topics, right? So I'm also thinking out loud as I, in some cases, give responses to you here. One way I think this is going to evolve essentially is we will probably see more automated data labeling, data annotation, particularly with machine data. We are already seeing a lot of companies, I don't know if you've heard of companies like Kore.ai, Kore.ai, and the others, they're all starting to move into this territory of doing automated annotation and labeling of machine data. The broader point essentially is the cost of actually adding metadata is far cheaper during the initial phase of collecting the data than it is to add in the later parts of the data workflow, right, obviously. The second aspect that I think is also going to become more important is the issue of data lineage, where you actually understand where the data is coming from. And obviously that allows the models to make better decisions. Because if the data sources are more reputed and qualified data sources, the models are going to give it a higher ranking, eventually in a retrieval ranking. Whereas if the data sources are low quality, obviously it's going to push it down from a ranking perspective, essentially, right? So the data lineage is important because the models want to understand where the data is coming from, how much has data changed, who initially created the data, and how much changes were made to the data, and so on and so forth. The third aspect that I think is going to become very important from a data perspective is, see, I think in the presentation I shared this, right, which is fundamentally enterprises will bring data into LLMs in two different ways. One is through RAG, and the other is through fine-tuning, right? Now with RAG, the challenge that a lot of organizations will have with RAG, despite the tremendous popularity of RAG, and I actively advocate, by the way, RAG as an approach for more customers, but the challenge that customers have with RAG essentially is the actual act of determining what data becomes part of the RAG architecture and how to chunk that data is still a very human-driven process, right? So perhaps what may happen in the future is we may have more auto-chunking tools, for example, that can look at a PDF and say, hey, I scanned through this 50-page PDF. It looks like the use case that we have is a customer-facing chatbot. And I believe that these parts of the PDF documents are more valuable than other parts of the PDF documents for this use case, which means that, again, it's going to have a higher ranking in the vector search when you're indexing the vector search and you're retrieving that information, right? So again, in a RAG architecture, I hope that we will see more automation in terms of how we bring enterprise knowledge, enterprise information, and how we represent that and how we rank that within the environment. With fine-tuning, what we will probably see is a lot more emphasis on the quality of data and a lot more emphasis on mitigating things like PII, PHI style information, right? Because with fine-tuning, if you're bringing data that has problematic attributes, it's highly likely that those attributes will be reflected in the output of the model as well. So we have to mitigate some of the data privacy and data security risks, as we bring the data into the workflow. So fine-tuning, again, will have very extensive data engineering, where we spend a lot of time cleaning up the data. Again, some of this will be automated, in my opinion, over a period of time, and also a lot of emphasis on the PII, PHI aspect of that as well.
Can you speak a little bit? I was very interested in you saying that you should use a composable GenAI architecture. And I'm in the architecture group at my company. We make this mistake all the time where we buy large monolithic things. The next thing we know, we have 3 Cadillacs in our garage. And here we are at a Kore.ai conference, and they have a very unified, I would say, comprehensive suite. How do we follow a composable architecture when we're investing in tools like Kore.ai, but also keeping sort of a unified interface among the enterprise without getting too disparate in how we do this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, fundamentally, we believe that a GenAI platform has primarily 4 layers. There is the infrastructure layer, there is the model layer, there is the data and the model engineering tools, and then there are the application services that we're building on top. So one of the things that we advocate for is to have a fair degree of separation between the engineering tools and the models themselves. For example, if you're doing RAG, you want to use vector databases or some kind of a vector search along with the model. And to the extent possible, you want to use vector databases or vector search that is agnostic to the underlying model, in the sense that you can bring OpenAI models, you can bring Llama models, you can bring Gemini models from Google, and so on and so forth. Similarly, you have tools for model deployment. For example, there's a project called Ray, which is a very popular open source project for deploying these models. Again, you want to use tools that are either open or tools that are primarily model agnostic. Similarly, we spoke a lot about model safety, right? There are tools that are out there from vendors like Weights and Biases and Kore.ai, Fiddler.ai, Kore.ai. All of these are startups that are primarily providing model observability and bias and fairness detection and so on and so forth. And again, to the extent possible, these tools are very agnostic to the underlying models as well. What we are trying to also tell customers is, I think it's, as much innovative as OpenAI is, and I give them a lot of credit for what they've done in this space, it's still very early days in this space, you know what I mean? It's really hard to know which of these companies are going to be uber successful in the future, which of these models are going to be uber successful in the future, which is why trying to abstract the models away, even if you're with the same provider, right? It doesn't even have to be like multiple provider, right? Even OpenAI, we went from 3.5 to 4 to 4 Turbo, and I think this summer 5 is coming out. All of this is in 14 months or 15 months time. So you really want to make sure that you are abstracting the model layer to the extent possible. And the way to do that is to really have these engineering tools that are as agnostic as possible. And also the UX layer. If you're using Kore.ai, you're kind of well protected there, right? Because Core does bring multiple models underneath the cover, so you kind of retain the workflow, you retain the UX, and kind of really abstracting the model. That's kind of what we really need. Or to say the other way, the models should be swappable, in our opinion, either from the same provider or across providers to the extent possible. Yes.
So how are enterprises solving for challenges of sending customer data to right?
Yeah.
You build a whole are there any other things advice?
Yeah, I think again, it really varies by scenario. I think if you're just doing prompt engineering, obviously you want to encrypt the prompts as the prompts are being sent to the cloud provider environment. And also you want to work with providers, as I said earlier, that don't take your prompt data and further train the model, right? Most enterprise providers don't do it, but it's always good to do a cross-check of that. Some of them do store the prompts for like a 30-day period, but that's primarily because they're mandated regulatory to store the data for a 30-day period for something called abuse monitoring. When you're doing RAG or fine-tuning, again, you have more choices because you can bring your own encryption keys, for example. Obviously, you want to run the models in your VPCs, in your account rather than running it in the provider account. And again, there are data obfuscation tools. I use the term obfuscation than masking because masking is one way to obfuscate the data, but there are other ways to obfuscate the data as well. That is also very common that we see in customer environments today. But there are still a lot of customers, nevertheless, despite all of that I've said, they're still worried about sending data to the cloud, which is why they are working with model providers that can actually run the models within their environments. So obviously with open source models, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of determining where to run the models. Or you could work with model hubs, for example, like Hugging Face is an example, right? Where Hugging Face is bringing 100,000 plus open source models, and they're willing to implement some of these in a private marketplace, in a private environment today. I think that's another practice that we see as well. But broadly speaking, encryption, masking, loss prevention, things that you can do contractually in terms of SLAs to make sure that you're protecting your data. All of these are techniques that enterprises are looking at today to make sure that they Okay, one last question because I was just given the 5-minute time. Yes.
So I think on the build versus buy, from the models perspective, pretty much makes sense. Most of us will start buying with AI models around. And we are seeing this year, last year, this RAG is also being commoditized. Like Salesforce has their own, like new Salesforce, they have their own use. Pega as an example for something, Box as an example. So this RAG is also being commoditized. And in the marketplace, we see data agnostic tools, like for example, Kore, where we can bring the data horizon, data domain specific like Salesforce. So it now brings us like confusion on, okay, hey, if Salesforce is offering us a RAG on their data, should we buy that, or should we build like decentralized with the data agnostic tools like Kore and do it? So that's like a problem. We are in the junction, and of course user experience is another layer on top of it, but at least in the data side, we're in the junction of this deciding what's our approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good question.
and again, it's something that we'll see more and more. I fundamentally believe that when you use the word commoditization, I actually view that as a very good thing for a user. I mean, you should be worried if you're a vendor, if you commoditize, but I think for a user, that means more choice and that means more flexibility. I think fundamentally, whether you go with a Salesforce Einstein pilot or whether you do it on Kore.ai, I think it's really a function of a few things. I truly believe that data has gravity, so to speak, right? And this is one of the active topics of debate last year, right? Which is, will AI move to data or will data move to AI, right? I mean, the point being, when ChatGPT was new or the GPT models were new, people were willing to move data because the models were only running in the Azure environment, which means that you need to have your data there to take advantage of it. But now I believe that the models are becoming increasingly ubiquitous, right? I mean, every model provider can today provide you a variety of models, right? They can provide you with OpenAI API, Cloud API, or Gemini API, they can give you open source model. So one way to really think about this is in terms of data, which is, where is my data? What is the cost of moving the data to a new environment? What are the privacy implications of moving the data? Do we have permission from the data owners and the others who even move the data and so on and so forth? So I would argue that data in many cases dictates where the AI models should be running and where the use cases should be running for large. That's, I think, the first aspect. The second aspect of it is obviously the businesses themselves, the business units making determination. For example, if you want to sell Kore.ai related to Salesforce to, I don't know, your CRM, your salespeople, for example, I mean, can you make that same, in the sense that can you convince them that both of these tools are comparable to each other? Because in their minds, they may not be comparable to each other, which is why maybe running a pilot with them and making sure that they're comfortable with the UX differences between both of those. I think that's an important aspect as well, in my opinion. The last aspect, obviously, is the cost. You want to be very careful in terms of not double dipping, in the sense that you're not paying for the same capabilities from two different vendors, right? And I think that's where having a core platform, I think, is very valuable, right? Because if you have a core platform and your business user comes to us and say, hey, we want to use Salesforce because it's bad, you're like, hey, we're doing the same thing here. We've already paid for it. We can make it available to you. So you're not like doing double dipping, which is very dangerous. And I think there's a lot of double dipping that's going to happen in organizations. For example, we're already seeing that with co-pilots, right? Where people are saying, oh, we have Copilot, but then we have ServiceNow that's coming with a Copilot. We have someone else that's coming with a Copilot. And the capabilities are overlapping in many cases, which means that we're paying for the same thing, essentially to two different vendors, and you want to avoid that as well. But that's where I think having that centralized platform architecture can be very valuable, because you can go back to the business and say, hey, this is what we have, and if the business doesn't heed, hopefully your CFO is going to come to your help and say, we're not going to pay for it again. Hey, I know this is, there are probably more questions, but hopefully we took enough questions. And again, I'd like to really thank you for this opportunity, for being here and sharing my